good. I think we can start. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar organized by the Swedish Institute of International Affairs Middle East and North Africa program. My name is Isabell. I'm head of the program and I will be moderating this conversation. This webinar is the second in a series of three which deals with Israel and Palestine. The first one was on international law, and this one is going to delve into Israeli politics and Israeli life, if you will. And the third one, which will take place in a couple of weeks, will be on Palestinian society. And for this conversation, which is dealing with Israel, we have two excellent panelists who are going to have a conversation with some help from me, perhaps. And that's Dr. Dalia Scheindlin, who is a public opinion expert and strategic consultant with over 2 decades of experience. She's presently a fellow at the Century Foundation, co-hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcast, and writes for Plus972 website. And also joining us from Gothenburg in Sweden is Professor Isabell Schierenbeck. She's a professor of political science at the School of Global Studies, and her main research field is state building and political leadership, and she has written extensively on the Middle East and Israeli politics in particular. Welcome to the both of you. We are going to be trying to shed some light on what's happening in Israel in and of itself, rather than looking at it simply or solely through the lens of the conflict with the Palestinians. And in order to set the scene, I've asked Dalia to give us a bit of a survey of where things stand at the moment. Please.
Okay, thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and thank you to all attendees. What I'd like to do is try to set the stage by explaining where we are in Israeli society in terms of attitudes towards the conflict very briefly, and then look more deeply at Israeli society to understand how we got to this situation in terms of domestic politics. So, the first part is really very short. We can have longer conversations about it. But if we ask, how is Israeli society looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the answer is it's not really. It's not particularly high on the agenda right now. If you were to ask for a list of the top priorities in the country, resolving the conflict would be third, fourth, or even lower. Certainly with Corona, it's probably on the lower end of that. And moreover, support for the kind of peace that everybody once assumed for a time was the paradigm for peace, the two-state solution, has been declining in Israeli society. And I will say, for the purposes of illustration, that it's not only in Israeli society. In general, it's in Palestinian society as well. I can't share my screen. If you want to turn on the screen sharing, I will show a couple of slides. But in the meantime, you can take it from me and I will show you the data shortly, that in fact, support has been incrementally declining among Israelis and Palestinians for the two-state solution, to the point where it's now below half on both sides. It's a mirror image, in fact. Support stands at about 42, 43% on both sides. So the majority opposes it at this point. This is, again, an incremental decline over the course of the last decade. And I do have screen share, so you'll see it right now. Okay. Okay, I think everybody should see the graph showing the last decade of the tracking survey that I am involved in with Israelis and Palestinians. And you can see that in the early part of the decade, support was over, certainly a majority for both populations and for most of the decade, but it has been incrementally declining. What is interesting is the parallel on both sides. Now, I'm gonna just take this down briefly let's see, I want to go back. Where is my stop share? Here. Okay, sorry, I'm doing a little stop share.
No worries.
Okay, that's okay. I'm going to pull this back up shortly. Now, I want to try to understand how we got here, how we got to this drop off in support, in the sense that how are domestic politics related to this? Going back, I won't show you a graph for everything, but going back to the domestic conditions of Israeli society, thinking back to the 2000s, the Second Intifada was a turning point in terms of the portion of Israelis who consider themselves to be left-wing dropping. And then the disengagement in 2005, when Israel pulled its settlements out of Gaza, cemented a climbing percentage of Israeli society who considered themselves to be right-wing, to the point where ultimately, by the sort of late part of the decade, let me share this again and I will show you, what we see is Israeli society looks something like the following, okay? By the end of the decade, by the end of the first decade, we have over half or about half of Jewish society. These are Jews only in these surveys, in the graph. About a quarter who consider themselves centrist, so about over half who are right-wing, about a quarter who are centrist, roughly 15% among Jewish society who consider themselves left-wing. And once that pattern is set, you can see that it didn't change very much throughout the course of the last decade. So over the current decade, those basic proportions of Israeli society remain. If you look at total Israeli society, weighting as in giving the proper proportion to the Arab citizens and their self-identification, just to give you the updated figures, you have very few who consider themselves to be right-wing. You can see that on the side. About a quarter who are centrists and roughly 40% who are left-wing, big portion who do not want to identify themselves. So all of Israeli society breaks down with about half who are right-wing, a little, maybe slightly more, and the center and left together are somewhere over 40%. This leads to a pretty stable breakdown of the Knesset, okay? And that's why we see, and this is just going to be my last slide for illustration, that's why we see that over the course of this time, okay, after the ups and downs of the first decade of the 2000s, okay, especially the appearance of a centrist party in 2006, or what Israeli society considers centrist, by the time you get to 2009, when Netanyahu comes around, in fact, the basic blocks of parties that go into either right-wing coalitions, or in later years, we now consider them Netanyahu loyalist coalitions, doesn't change very much. And the center plus the left parties together, which is a logical combination because they were in opposition, certainly in the last stable government before 2019, has a similar proportion in Israeli society. It's interesting when we get into the demographic dynamics, how this situation comes to be. But this is the basic map of Israeli society. Now, I can bring you a little bit up to date and just say that the only thing that's changed since the last elections were held in early March is that polls are showing that one of the right-wing parties is on the rise. And as a result, the right-wing Netanyahu loyalist bloc, even without Mr. Lieberman, for anybody who is following very closely, is at this point over 65. The graph I'm showing you right now includes Mr. Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, who started a lot of this trouble when he decided not to go into a coalition with Netanyahu, even though he's a right-wing party. Without him in 2020 and 2019, we would have had, well, we did have 60 or fewer than 60. But current polls show that even without Lieberman, the right-wing parties are getting in the mid-60s. They're only polls, as we all know. Who knows better than me that polls sometimes have problems. But now that I've shown you that, I want to go back a little bit to why, how we got there, just very briefly in terms of the structure of Israeli society, and what kinds of conditions, are behind those ideological breakdowns. Okay. One of the main things is how religious and how secular Israelis are. And I start with that because it is the deepest demographic divide in Israeli society. When we look at what is predictive of left-right attitudes, the religious secular divide is essentially the most predictive. It's not one for one. There are secular people who are right-wing, but they are a minority, about a third. And not every single religious person is right-wing, but over 90%. And then there's people who are traditionalists who break down about 70% right-wing. So the more religious you are, the more right-wing you are. This is such a consistent finding that I call it the iron law of Israeli society. Religious people have a higher growth rate in the population than secular people because they have more children. And as a result, we would have expected, even starting 20 years ago, that Israel would simply become more and more and more right-wing as the religious, portion of society grows. But I just showed you the graph showing a certain measure of stability over the last 10 years for the right-wing parties in terms of the number of coalition seats that they win, or Knesset seats, I should say. That is a real nuance, and I think what we're seeing there, because my colleagues, not me, who do demographic research, have noticed that despite very high levels of birth rate and population growth among religious populations, by the time you look at the 18 and 20-year-old plus part of the population, their growth rate doesn't keep up with their birth rate. In other words, there's some level of attrition from religious communities. I connect those dots. I think it's an educated hypothesis to say that if there's some level of attrition from religious communities, there is also a balance, some sort of balancing force to how much further the right wing portion of society can grow, because that demographic is so closely tied to political attitudes. So that's one interesting thing to keep our eyes on. I mean, demographically, we should see the religious population growing. It is growing, but slower than anticipated 20, 30 years ago. At the same time, we see the portion of right-wing parties maintaining stable amounts over the last 10 years. What about social and economic issues? In the early part of the decade, shortly after Prime Minister Netanyahu came to power again, we had a huge social economic protest. But it obviously didn't shake up his leadership. He's won many elections since then. And the main reason is that for Israelis, social and economic concerns are considered apolitical. They are not, most of the public does not see a major difference between the parties on their economic policies, even though there are differences. But they generally don't vote for different parties because of how they perceive party differences on economic issues, or even to some extent social issues. Primarily when Israelis map themselves on the political left, right, or center, they are thinking about the conflict. Actually, I should specify that has to do with the right and the left. Centrists, this term is very murky in Israeli society. That I've got a long analysis about it if anybody is interested. But at present, when you talk about being centrist, it tends to mean that you do place economic concerns, middle class concerns a little higher. And the fate of centrist parties has generally been that they can do well for one or two cycles, but they tend not to become parties that keep rising sufficiently to get into power. So the demographic and ideological breakdown supports the right, even though it wasn't growing enough to lead to an all-out Netanyahu victory throughout 2019 and 2020. The centrist party that was doing well before that, called Yesh Atid, didn't see sufficient power in its growth to actually take over, so it merged with a new party, the party of Benny Gantz, and they created Blue and White, which has a little bit of an identity crisis. So while they did pretty well in elections 3 times in a row, they didn't do well enough to take over the government, and now there's a strange coalition of strange bedfellows who don't get along very well. Okay, in the meantime, of course, Netanyahu is facing investigations. The investigations turned into indictments as of November 2019. His trial has begun, the preliminary phase has begun, and in January he is slated to begin the argument phase in which he will have to appear in court. So we have a government that doesn't function very well. We have a right-leaning, broadly right-leaning population, and a prime minister under a great deal of legal pressure, who has built his reputation over the last 10 years, kind of fighting back against the challenges of a social protest and investigations, generally by using a populist theme, the populism being, sowing and leveraging divisions, specifically, I would say, ethno-nationalist tensions between the Jewish and Arab population of Israel, competing and trying to outbid with the further right-wing nationalists among the religious parties and among Lieberman, who used to be in that category. And so, he faces a gamble right now. Try to stick with the current government, which isn't functioning very well and which he doesn't like very much, or go into another election. And if he were to go into another election, how would he do it? Well, the current government is so dysfunctional that they haven't passed a budget yet. They were they formed this coalition primarily to deal with Corona. And to do that, you need to pass a budget. But the one thing they failed to do was pass a budget. And the other thing they failed to do was rein in Corona. So we had a second wave, a second lockdown, and still no budget. We have the budget deadline was extended. Now I'm bringing you right up to speed until where we are today. And with that, I will end. The budget was supposed to be passed in August. At the last minute, elections were avoided by postponing that until December. At this point, on December 23rd, if there's no budget passed, Israel will have to go into elections again. And if that's the case, if Netanyahu wants that to be the case, there are a number of reasons why it might be good for him if we try to think about, his calculations. And I think, the main reason is that he likes to have a renewed electoral mandate, as he goes into his legal proceedings, because it just somehow generates a better environment, to support him, even though it shouldn't have an impact on the legal process. That's a gamble, of course, if he wins. He could theoretically replace the Attorney General if he wins big enough, and the Attorney General, who is responsible for a lot of his troubles as he sees it, some sort of a subversive coup against him. And that would possibly help him to appoint more sympathetic figures. But I also think that he might really just want to go into elections simply for the election campaign. Because during an election campaign, if the elections were to be called in December, he's still got 3 weeks while US President Trump is in office before the transition, if there is a transition. And during that time, he can highlight the wonderful friendship with the US, the wonderful gifts that Trump has given Netanyahu and Israel. Maybe Trump will see fit to give some other sort of gift to Israel during that election campaign. I don't think it will be quite as generous, because I don't think Trump will be very interested by that point, but maybe he will turn a blind eye if Netanyahu were to move ahead on some portion of annexation, even if it's on a minimal level in the West Bank. And, in that sense, this brings us back to how all of Israeli domestic politics has a long-lasting impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So a lot of open questions. None of them look very, very auspicious for the future of conflict resolution for now. Sorry not to be more hopeful. Maybe we'll get into the hopeful parts later.
Let's hope. Thank you for that presentation. Isabell, is there anything in particular that you would like to pick up on? I have several questions, but I want you to start.
No, I think I couldn't have explained it better myself, and I think I'm making the same analysis. I think one of the really interesting things now is that actually Netanyahu is challenged from the right in a slightly different way than when we looked at Lieberman's agenda of how he has tried to challenge him. So I think that's something that we could definitely discuss, and also obviously. What it will mean for Netanyahu that Biden most likely will be the new president of the United States, because that can be something that it's immediately something that we might think it's something bad for Netanyahu, because he built lots of his populist and his agenda as a politician on his close ties with Trump, but at the same time, he knows Biden, and Biden is also much more predictable. So I'm not sure that necessarily will be something bad for Netanyahu in that sense. So I think that's also something, but I'm sure we will get back to all of those points later on, but that's my two first reactions.
Okay, very good. As we used to say in the previous millennia, let's rewind the tape a bit. And go back to some of the structural issues that you also mentioned. Like all societies, Israeli society has a number of cleavages, and some of them overlap, some of them are synchronized, and that can, in a sense, both explain the deepness of some of the depth of some of the conflicts. And there are several of them that have really nothing to do with the Palestinians, as far as I can see from the outside. So, when we're talking about the secular and religious, we're talking Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, these are issues that would have been there even if there had been no Palestinians. So, in that sense, there is some level of independence in the variable, if you want to put it like that. So I would like to see what you what is your assessment, the both of you, in terms of where these cleavages are going? And they have obviously an historical background, but what has changed in the last, say, 10, 20 years? Isabell, would you like to start?
Yes, I think one important thing that Dalia didn't mention, and I think has to do with one of the cleavages, or maybe 2 or 3 of the cleavages, because as we all know, they are very interlinked and they overlap in lots of different ways, and that's the Russian immigration. And I think that for many, the opening up after the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the large migration to Israel by mainly Russians, but also Jews from all over the former Soviet Union, there was an idea that this will mean that there will be lots of Ashkenazi, secular people moving to Israel. And from that perspective, also, since Ashkenazi Jews and secular mostly have been going to the center and the left, there was this idea that the first thoughts about this was, well, they will ultimately then go for also end up being in the centrist leftist camp, which they did maybe to a slight degree in the first election, where we had a large Russian community in Israel. But we know that this is not the case. And I think this is also something that is one of the big changes also when we think about the figures that Dalia showed, that we have this rise of the more leaning towards the right, and that's also why I partly think that it's something that will continue, that we have a right today that it's more secular in one way than it used to be, maybe, and that is partly because of the Russian immigration. So I think that's one important way to look upon this. The other point I just would like to do is also with regard to the ultra-Orthodox community. And I think that's super interesting that the birth rate is sort of going down there. And I think that has to do with the changes within the ultra-Orthodox community. I mean, we have an ultra-Orthodox community today where men, but also women, are working much more outside of the community. They take part in the Israeli labor market to a large extent. And we also have a part of them entering into the non-religious educational system. I mean, I myself is working a bit with an ultra-Orthodox woman from an ultra-Orthodox community, for instance, in one of the universities in Israel. And I think that this is something really interesting, like Dalia also pointed to, like what will happen with the ultra-Orthodox community if they continue to take part to a greater extent in the Israeli society. And I think this is also one of the very obvious trends we have seen and that we will probably see more of. So that's just to point to 2 of the cleavages that I think can explain part of this shift.
Could I respond to some of that a little bit? Just to sort of add and clarify. Very, very helpful additions on both of them. I would say, let me clarify, when I was talking about the religious community, I may have said ultra-Orthodox, but it's actually the case among both the ultra-Orthodox communities and the national religious community that there is a gap between birth rate and population growth. So we should take that into account. In fact, if we can attribute that to attrition, it's generally understood by the people who study this quantitatively that the attrition rate is higher somewhat among the national religious population. So both of those communities are undergoing changes, although we didn't always track this kind of thing in the past, so we don't know if it's so different. The former Soviet immigration is fascinating. We could talk about that for a long time. Of course, I agree. There's no question that they certainly went very right wing. And I well remember those early years in the 1990s when many left wingers, rather, in a way, it was a rather wishful thinking, sort of ignorant assessment that they might go to the left. Of course, they hated the left because anything that reminded them of communism was awful. And they were in making, well, some of them didn't have a choice, but in moving to a Jewish state after having had their Jewish identity suppressed in the former Soviet Union, they did exactly what you said. They remained secular, but they became very devoted to the Jewish nationalist identity of Israel, and that propelled them to right-wing politics quite soon. Really, even in the first election, it wasn't that they were left-wing. It's that some of them voted for Russian-oriented parties for immigration, like Natan Sharansky.
Yeah.
But there was only really one election where the majority, a bare majority of the former Soviet immigration voted for a leftist candidate, and that was 1999. Ever since then, they've voted very strongly right-wing. And in recent years, that community breaks down more closely to general Jewish society in terms of their self-identification as right-wing, similar to the numbers that I showed you before, with lower on the left, but otherwise similar. And in terms of their party breakdown, not that different from the rest of Israeli society, except with an elevated vote for Mr. Lieberman. Maybe a quarter of them vote for him. Yeah, other than that, the only thing we haven't gone into too deeply is the Ashkenazi Mizrahi divide, which is certainly there, and it's overlapping with both religion, not so much the ultra-Orthodox, but really secular versus traditionalist. And it overlaps with socioeconomic divides. So it's very much an overlapping factor. As an independent variable, if you will, because Rosebeh, you mentioned independent and dependent variables. As an independent variable, the Ashkenazi Mizrahi divide is not as powerful as religious identity. So if you just take an Ashkenazi and a Mizrahi person, if they are all Ashkenazi and all Mizrahi, because many people are mixed, we have a growing portion of society who are mixed, maybe over 30%. And they are both secular and both highly educated, because education is somewhat related, lower than all those. And they're, let's say, older, because age also factors into this. They are more likely both to be centrist, maybe center-leaning left, than if the Mizrahi person happens to be traditional as well, in terms of what we call traditionalist religiously. And in that case, the Ashkenazi Mizrahi divide is, more significant, because an Ashkenazi traditionalist might be a little more liberal. But if they're both religious, the Ashkenazi is just as likely to be right-wing as the Mizrahi. The ultra-Orthodox populations are vastly more Ashkenazi and very heavily right-wing. So it gets to be a little bit murky, and that's why the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide is essential for understanding Israeli society, but I would be cautious about assuming that it explains attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of right, left, or center.
Can I
One second, Isabel. Could I just, is there then also a difference between the narrative about Israel and this underlying reality that you can see looking at it sociologically? I'm saying, are people talking in terms of Ashkenazim and Mizrahi more than it actually is the reason why they vote however they do or whatever it is?
It depends on who you ask. I mean, if you ask a particular commentator named Avishai Ben Chaim, everything in Israeli society can be reduced to the Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide. As a public opinion researcher for 21 years, I think he's completely wrong. I'm not just a researcher, I'm a strategist. I'm supposed to tell parties how to get votes. And trust me, if you reach out to them on that basis, or if you just put a Mizrahi candidate up as the head of the Labor Party, it may help a little bit, but it's not going to change the fundamental divide that the ideological breakdown that I showed you before.
Right. Thank you. Isabel?
No, I think also, one important other group that I think we need to talk about, even though they have failed to be allowed into the government for the whole history of Israel, and that's the Arab Palestinian Israelis. So I think there also, it's really interesting to see how they have changed over the years. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's as clear politically how they are moving, because it's about going forth and back. And we know right now, actually, that there is again a situation where the joint list maybe that is made up of 4 different Palestinian Arab Israeli parties, that they might actually divide again, But I think still that what we can see is, the last elections, the last year at least, in the 3 elections we had, we can see that they are coming together more and more. And we can also see that they have started to vote again to a much higher degree than they did since basically 1999 and 2003. So I think this is also something important to just keep an eye on, even though I still think we are very far away from actually having Israeli government when they are invited as true coalition partners, even though Gantz and spoke about it, and Netanyahu is now trying to move on this for various reasons that I'm sure we can talk about. You know, he's now the last weeks only trying to really engage with one of the more Islamic parties in this joint list, you know. So, but I think there is something going on there, and that's something also I think it's really interesting that we have an Arab, Palestinian, Israeli population that is more jointly speaking with one voice, maybe. And also that they have found a leader in Odeh so far that I think is also talking a bit to the Jewish Israelis, that the Jewish Israelis, it was a minor group, but there were still a few percentage that actually started to vote for him the last election. And I think this is something really interesting to see if we have a party leader for a joint list where actually could attract part of the Jewish Israelis, even if they are a very small group, obviously. So I would be super interested to hear what you have to say about that, Claudia.
You mean me?
Yeah,
Adalia.
Adalia.
I don't want to brag, but I did consult for the Joint List Party on the Jewish vote in the last election, and after sitting around and comparing all of the actual results in every ballot station, not every ballot station, but in a sample of ballot stations, there was a rise, and it was a notable rise among the Jewish populated ballot districts. You know, it's not a high proportion at all. You know, so when I told people that, they said, what, it was a 100% rise from 1 to 2? Not quite. It was bigger than that, but in many cases it was like, you know, 20 to 40 or you know, 16 to 30 or something like that, or 30 to 50. You know, significant enough, and across a number of very, very traditional, you know, I mean, let's say centrist, blue and white, Yesh Atid, labor areas, including, by the way, the particular ballot station where the prime minister votes.
Yeah,
I took some pride in that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think what's going on there. So and that's also why I'm so worried now when we see this. I mean, again, Netanyahu, I think one of the things also that we need to really also be clear with is that Netanyahu has been extremely successful as a politician, and what he's doing right now also, like really targeting the joint list and trying to fragment the joint list for his own purpose. It's just the latest example of how he's navigating the political spectrum in Israel, so yeah,
it's very true. He is very skilled at identifying who his political threats are. If it's a party, he then finds a way to break them up, or create a dynamic in which they don't do well, which he's done many times over, especially with most famously now with blue and white. If it's an individual, he finds a way to put them in irrelevant positions so nobody ever hears about them again. He's very strategic about finding a way to keep himself towering, or his party towering above the others.
I wanted to kind of go back a bit again on some of the things that you mentioned, Dalia. I mean, in a sense, in this conversation so far, it's clear that we have a kind of an osmosis between the religious, secular, whatever the constellations are. The younger generations are, if you will, more integrated. They're not predictable based on these identity markers in the same way as perhaps their parents are. Would that be going too far, or is that?
Yeah, because there is something sort of, well, keep asking your question, and then I will relate to.
So that's one aspect of how things have changed over the decades, that you cannot at least assume that just because you are born in this family, your preferences will continue to be the same as your parents. And this is not, you know, that's quite, normal in the sense of being frequent in other cases as well. But the one thing that struck me was that you said that when it comes to left and right, socioeconomic issues are not what defines left and right. And that's, for me, interesting and a bit contradictory, because on the one hand, then the conflict has kind of become a backdrop that people perhaps don't see, and they literally don't see. There is a wall in some places and so on. But then at the same time, there is a left and a right. So what is the criterion for being left or being right?
That you've just summarized the entire you've just characterized Israeli political society. It's exactly the contradiction. Nobody wants to resolve the conflict. I mean, not nobody, but it's not high on the agenda because people think it's unrealistic. But it is there, it is omnipresent because it determines whether people consider themselves to be on the right or the left side of the map, first of all, and center too, because the center is more like the left. So you have to accept basic ideas like two-state solution, the fact that there needs to be a resolution to the conflict, and then you can fit yourself in the centrist camp. That is exactly the contradiction of Israeli life. I can't tell you any more about why it's a contradiction other than to say that's human nature to have that contradiction. I guess what is unusual for Israel, what sets Israel apart from other democratic political systems. I'm not going to say Israel's a democracy, but it does have a democratic political system, is that the economic piece of it does not determine whether people are right, left, or center. It may drive people who identify with the center more than the right or the left, somewhat, because they'll say, I'm tired of all this left-right stuff. I care about middle-class concerns. But again, then they need to focus on one particular party that labels itself centrist. Nobody votes for, very few or a small portion of Likud voters support Likud because they originally stood for free market liberal economics. Very few. Nobody even remembers that the L in Likud stands for liberal. And liberal at that time did not mean LGBT rights in the 1960s when it was established. It meant free market liberal or economics, and that's something that most people don't think about so much. Many people criticize the neoliberal economic policies that Netanyahu has come to represent. But again, if the social protest around this in 2011 was so consciously, almost strictly non-political. You were not supposed to call for a change of government or criticize a party, and you certainly weren't supposed to talk about the conflict because economics unites people, doesn't divide them. So it doesn't really influence the political system in a strange way. And nobody really believes that labor stands for old socialism anymore. Netanyahu barely even accuses them of that because he knows it's not very effective, barely. Just one point about the question of how predictable people are. I would be, again, if you are born into a religious or a secular family, there is a very good, that's a very good indicator of whether you're going to come out right-wing, centrist, or left-wing, with a few other parameters. In terms of age, in Israel, it's been very clear for at least, I would say 15 years now, that older people tend to be more moderate in their political opinions, and younger people are more right-wing. They self-identify as more right-wing, they hold more right-wing positions, and it makes sense because of what I said before, that the religious populations are more right-wing, the religious populations have a higher birth rate, the younger cohorts have a higher portion of religious people, and therefore right-wingers. So it does make sense. What we don't know is, are the older age groups more moderate because of religious attrition and people moving towards the center and left? Or have they always become more moderate over the years, because they're just older? I think this is probably a combination. There is an older stereotype that I see in post-communist countries that I've worked. I've worked in 15 other countries, many of them in the former communist countries, not so much former Soviet, but I have worked in Ukraine. But I'm talking about Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. The people who support the socialist parties tend to be these sort of older, rural, it's for slightly different reasons, but it's something that relates to the previous generation's idealism on some level. So for all of those reasons, we have the older generation, 55 and plus, who are more center and left combined, and anybody who's 18 to 35 is significantly more right-wing.
Thank you. Isabell?
Yeah, no, but I think another issue that is interesting is also if we think about Israel from more of a comparative perspective, and then we see also that this right-wing move and the kind of politics that Likud and Netanyahu that has been guiding them. It's also something that we find throughout Europe to a larger extent today. We have declining social democratic parties, and we have the rising of populist right-wing parties. So I think Israel is not that isolated. Lots of times we tend to think about Israel as this very unique special case, but in very many ways, even though we speak about lots of different and more cleavages, for instance, when we talk about Israel now, than we do in Sweden, I still think that we see very similar trends throughout Europe, and not to talk about the States during Trump. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is that I think it's interesting is to think about the scenario that the Israeli politics continue to go in the direction of where the conflict is less and less relevant. I mean, it's more and more irrelevant for the Israeli population in one way, because it's not on the agenda in the same way, at least, that it used to be. And we also see continuation of this normalization that Netanyahu and Trump just started. I mean, because I think that's something interesting also when we talked about annexation the last some months ago, before the election and so on. There is lots of people who more and more think about, well, what would the difference be? You know, the occupied territories are more or less already annexed in one way or another, you know. So, yeah. And that's something I find interesting to think about. What will happen if this continues to be the case? What about, and at the same time, we see a continuation of poverty rates in Israel. I mean, we have had like the level of poverty among children and among elderly in Israel during the last years, and this is before Corona, and also the clear pattern of poverty being much harder against the ultra-Orthodox community and the Israeli Arab Palestinian Israelis, and also with regard to part of the Mizrahi society. So maybe then, I mean, it's interesting to think about that. Maybe that would actually mean that in the end, we will also see an increase in interest in the social issues in Israel, also when it comes to elections. That's something that I'm thinking a lot of. I don't say that this will be the case, but I'm think that it's interesting to reflect upon it.
But would this mean, because I mean, I hear you, and obviously, if you're talking about a de-ideologization when it comes to classical left-right issues, yeah, that's the case in you know, we have a managerial state that just manages stuff. It doesn't really pretend to have any particular ideological guiding lights or reference points in terms of what should be and how to get there. So that's a long-term trend, if you will, in many societies. But when was it Yair Lapid who started the Shinui party at some point because of the housing crisis? There you had someone who actually then tried to make this the centerpiece. This was what was going to woo people to the party. Now that party then, of course, ended up becoming defunct. But so for the moment, all of these parties have more or less the same economic program, or is it so irrelevant in terms of a platform for a voter mobilization that no one bothers to look at their economic program?
No, I mean, I think that they do, it's almost like a threshold. I mean, they know, listen, before Corona, right, it was a threshold that everybody wanted to promise the voters that they were aware of, you know, a very difficult economic climate in some ways, right? Israel has fabulous macroeconomics, or had until Corona. And it was something that Netanyahu generally, you know, very much boasted about and bragged about in his election campaigns. But there was no getting around the fact that at the individual level, salaries are not commensurate with costs. I mean, especially in the major urban areas, you know, housing costs, consumer goods, even basic consumer goods, you know, food items. People, you know, often spend more than half their salaries in rent, and then basic expenses takes up the rest, and it's almost impossible to save. And as a result, people know that they won't be able to buy homes. And so there's a lot of discontent about that. After the social protests, there were some, you know, attempts at policies, almost none of which eventually came to fruition, and the population continued to vote for Netanyahu. I'm not everybody, right? We're talking about a quarter of the population, roughly, depending on which election cycle. But you know, every party wants voters to believe that they will address that issue. And Isabell, in terms of the question of like whether people will, you know, if the trends continue and poverty deepens, I don't know. I mean, when I started working in the late 90s, we were talking about, for the first time, putting social economic issues at the front and center of a campaign, as opposed to ideological, you know, I mean, one time economy was ideological in this country, but after 1967, that kind of went away. So the campaign in 1999 that I worked on for the Labour Party and Ehud Barak was partly about, we'll get back to the peace process, we'll get out of Lebanon, but it was a lot about, high unemployment at the time, which we are not seeing now. Unemployment is not as high now, not nearly as high. Taxes are lower now. It was about student tuition. It was about overcrowded hospitals. That was a major part of the campaign. People forget. And then ever since then, every campaign I've worked on, and there have been 8 so far in the last 20 years, there's always a dilemma of, do we focus on the social economic issues in the hopes that this time people will finally put those issues at the center of their vote? And it's always a balance. There's never any great decision about it. And it certainly doesn't seem to work for the left. Again, it did work for the center. When you say that, when you mentioned Yair Lapid, I wouldn't eulogize his party quite so fast. It was one of the only center parties to actually stick around. I mean, they did very well their first election. Like most center parties, they lost power in their second run, but then they got power again in their third election, and then they merged with Benny Gantz, but then they broke up. So they're still there, and their polling is not bad. In fact, they're polling much better than Benny Gantz's phantom party, because Benny Gantz's party never really existed on its own.
Yeah, I think they have. I mean, in the latest poll, I think they're up to 18, 19.
Not alone. They're not, I don't think they're polling 18, 19 alone. They're on their own. They're more like 13, 14 as far as I remember. Yeah. But together with, well, actually, I shouldn't say that quite so. No, you may be right. You may be right. I think you're right.
It's 18 or something.
Yeah, I think you may be right, because I know that together, Yesh Atid and Benny Gantz's party together is generally polling in the mid-20s. So you're right. I shouldn't have said that.
18 now.
Yeah, because I always look at them together, because I think that ultimately they will run together again. I think neither of them will do well enough, in the polls to believe that they can run separately. Things may change by the time we see elections, but.
Can I just say something interesting here? I think it's also how Bennett now is building his part and his opposition towards Netanyahu, and it's not really social economic policy as we think about in politics, but it's really about Corona. I mean, it's like and it might be a very strategic, like during the Corona kind of way of arguing, but he's really talking pandemic and salaries, pandemic and salaries. I mean, that's what he's like out saying all the time. He even wrote this book on Corona now, so I think that's also something interesting in this is actually the two things he's really campaigning on now, or trying as an oppositional party leader. And I'm not sure he will keep to that if Corona is over and we will have, or when we will have another election. But it's really interesting, I think, that he's not talking about the traditional right-wing annexation kind of issues, but these are the two questions he's focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bennett is trying very hard to break out of the limited specific sectoral representation that he had all this time. Yeah. He and his partner in the party, Ayelet Shaked, tried hard in the first campaign cycle of 2019 by forming this kind of new right party, and they tried to run on a platform of being liberal but right-wing and secular and religious, and they weren't fooling anybody. They fell under the threshold, which is why, by the way, I don't totally believe this wave of surveys showing Bennett's party at over 20 seats. As a public opinion researcher, sometimes we see what we call bubbles. Yeah. So it could be a bubble. People are discontent, I mean, I'm not sure, because it's lasted for a little while, but if I were Bennett, I wouldn't count on having 25 seats in the next election. But he is obviously undertaking a strategy that tries to break out of just the national religious community, because the national religious community will never be enough. It's only about, at best 12% of total Israeli society, maybe even 11 to 12%. It's hard to know exactly, because it depends on margin of error, but somewhere between roughly 12% of Israeli society. They always split their vote between a national religious party and Likud, or even some vote for Haredi, ultra-Orthodox parties. So it will never be enough. And they completely failed to convince anybody outside that core in the first round of 2019. They did a little better, but it's very unusual to see a party go from that low to that high.
Yeah.
And certainly he's trying to do it by appealing to the thing that everybody is concerned with right now. And of course, his right-wing credentials with relation to annexation and the conflict are not under any question. He's been saying for so many years, he's been promoting his annexation plan, Bennett, since 2012.
Yeah, and I also think that his only way of actually being able to outmaneuver Netanyahu is to broaden the base, to broaden the issues in the way that he's doing now. And obviously also Corona is a very weak point for Netanyahu. So.
Sort of.
I'd like to get into that in a moment, but just for me as an amateur from the outside looking, I mean, in a sense, Netanyahu used to represent the mainstream right wing. With the coalition partners he's had off and on, and with the right-wing turn of Israeli society, which we can also see in some European countries, and we can get back to that in a moment, Naftali Bennett and others were to the right of Netanyahu. But is now Naftali Bennett trying to move towards the center, at least on some issues? And does that open up space for other smaller right-wing parties that are even maybe to the right of Naftali Bennett?
Oh, we have enough. If I was a right winger, I would do everything to prevent that. I mean, they got a little too big for their shoes. They got greedy. They saw there's a big right wing demand, so they started inventing more and more and more parties. The system can't sustain so many.
But will that then coalesce into something that is to the right of Naftali Bennett, or is he? I mean, he's obviously betting on being able to keep all of those voters and still get new ones.
Yeah.
But I also
usually when right-wing parties move slightly towards the center, someone comes to the right of them.
So I think here also we need to remember that this is also a lot about Bibi. It's a lot about Netanyahu here. So I mean, the day Netanyahu is leaving the Likud party, it would be, so I also think that what people Bennett might attract here also, without moving to the center very much, is people who are fed up with Netanyahu. There are not that many yet, but maybe there will be more, and who are then, for those reasons, willing to support Bennett. The question is what will happen when Netanyahu, whatever happens with him now with the trials, or if there is a different leadership in Likud, then I would say that that's also a question. And because lots of the latest election, the three latest election, has been a lot about Netanyahu. It has been a lot about, and also the demonstrations we see now. I mean, the demonstrations that they are planning for Saturday is basically like some slogan like, Trump had to go, now it's your time to go, or something like that, So I think it's very much about Netanyahu. And I think Bennett is very smart in positioning himself and Ayelet, the Shaked, the way they're positioning the party now in opposition to Netanyahu. It's will maybe not be as successful, I would say, the day when Likud has a different party leader.
Dalia?
Yeah.
Listen, there have been already attempts to have a further right-wing party, right? We have Itamar Ben-Gvir and his Jewish Power Party, and these very militarist, ultra-nationalist. I mean, I think of Bennett and Shaked as ultra-nationalists, but those were like more religious, more ultra-nationalist, and more extreme. I mean, they had former Kahana followers. So I mean, yeah, I don't know if you call the person himself former. I mean, anyway, point is, they were even more, and they didn't do very well. So, Bennett would have to make some sort of a break from the right in order for a party to come in to his right and actually get sufficient votes to cross. Remember, our voter threshold now for entering parliament is quite high. It's 3.75. You can't just get into parliament by, with 1% of the vote, the way in historic times in Israel. So you do need quite a lot of voters. And unless Bennett does something that really alienates the right wing, I'm not sure they can really sustain another party on the right that's not Haredi, not ultra-Orthodox, not national religious, or national religious but more hardline. Again, unless Bennett suddenly embraces the two-state solution, which he's not about to, or the Supreme Court, which he's not about to, because we should keep in mind that among the ideological divides in Israeli society, the conflict is always front and center, but more and more and more, There is a very visceral division over issues of the role of the functioning of democracy, the nature of the institutions, how they interact, and especially because the right wing believes that the country is being, taken over by an oligarchic left-wing dictatorship of the Supreme Court, which the center and the left think is absurd and dangerous for democracy. So that is becoming another increasing divide. There was another point that you mentioned that I wanted to raise, but I'll come back to it if I think about it.
But that's actually a good segue, because I mean, one of the things I think we should delve into a bit is this parallel, this kind of global development. And when I read some of the stuff that you've written, Dalia, but also others, it strikes me that some of the conversations or some of the lines people are taking in Israel are reminiscent of the evangelicals in the US in terms of, I mean, obviously we're now talking about some of the more extreme elements within the national religious camp, but the idea that, why should the Supreme Court with man-made laws, really decide in the end what's supposed to happen? And Naftali Bennett's party has been one of the parties that have been trying to, if you will, undermine the credibility and the position of the Supreme Court.
Oh, yes, I will.
And I mean, that's something that's happened in several places. So, I mean, if we could discuss that a bit, and from there, I think we can take it into Corona, because I mean, that's also one of the issues we see in many places where tracing and tracking people due to Corona either activates or creates the kind of state control that might not have otherwise been accepted by the population in the name of trying to stop a pandemic. Please.
Isabell, would you like to start?
Yeah, no, I think, I'm not sure I would say that, I'm not so convinced about the comparison with the evangelic. I'm more convinced, I see more the parallel to right-wing populist movements. Like Poland, Hungary, Trump to a certain, I mean, so I think in that perspective, Netanyahu and also Bennett and Shaked and those, they are really, like Dalia was saying, they are really having the idea and opinion that the institutions in Israel, like public service, like the High Court, like different laws around civil society organizations and you name it, that they have a bias. And I think it's not hard to understand why they think so, because in fact they are based in a very biased way on Ashkenazi institutions lots of times that were already established pre the state and then sort of like was carried into the state when Israel was established. And they continue to have a very strong majority. For instance, if you look at the courts, the High Court, there is a lot of, I mean, a strong Ashkenazi dominance and has been historically, for instance, and on leading positions in public service, in media, and so on. So I think what they have done is that they have like used this in a very similar way as we see in Sweden, for instance, the discussion on who are having the highest position in the Swedish society, who are having the highest positions in like public service and so on in different settings. So I think what they have understood is that this is actually a way of getting voters, and it's a way of like really having people starting to mobilize around those issues, and they have used this in that specific way. And with that also comes then the view on I mean, the whole fake news. We find the similar discussions in Israel and from the right wing in Israel with regard to fake news. And here also obviously Corona strategy, the way of like handling the Corona again, like the balance between it being politically handled or handled by experts on healthcare and so on. So and in the case of Corona, I actually had a piece in the Market last week on that with an Israeli colleague of mine on the politicization of Corona in Israel. And I think it's a very clear again that this from the very beginning has been a way for Netanyahu also to use Corona with regard to his own position his own stay in power, but also, I mean, the whole situation when the government coalition was put together, and the trial starting up for him. He has been used Corona during this whole period as a way to guarantee his own position and his own situation with regard to the trial and so on. So I don't remember really what your number one question was there now, but I see this as something more coming, I mean, more being less about the evangelic influence, so to say, and more about an influence or like a comparison with other right-wing populist movements around Europe and the States.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't saying that they're connected. I'm rather saying, I mean, you can see also in surveys now that evangelicals in the US vote for the Republican Party regardless of the religious tone or lack thereof in the Republican Party. So in a sense, it's an identification now where the religious bit is actually irrelevant. It's just that if you are an evangelical, or lots of them at least, will vote for the Republican Party, basically, regardless of what the Republican Party will have as a position on anything that has to do with religion per se, because there are other core issues that they basically trigger these people's mobilization. So that was more that kind of parallel. But Dalia, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would just to elaborate a little bit on the issue of kind of how the issue of the judiciary and the Supreme Court has come to play into Israeli politics. I completely agree that it is very much a mirror image of some of the right-wing populist movements in Europe and in the US. And in fact, if we're talking articles, I'm just finishing edits on a longish article comparing exactly how the US and Israel under Trump and under Netanyahu, but not just them personally, under the right-wing leadership in Israel and the Republican leadership in the US have made either the judiciary or the Supreme Court itself sort of, tried to undermine its role for the various purposes of, on the one hand, personal needs of both, two leaders who were facing criminal investigation or have policies that they, not policies, but they want to keep themselves in power and they think the court can somehow help them to do it in the case of Trump. And how they have, starting from that jumping off point, how they have undermined the legitimacy of the court in its role in governance. And to that end, I would just push back a little bit on the idea that the Israeli judiciary is still a bastion of Ashkenazi elitism. If you count up heads, right? If you do a head count of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, you're probably right. We know that. But I think that understates the much greater diversity among, for example, Supreme Court judges in terms of ideology and background relative to where we were 20, 30 years ago.
Of course.
I mean, there are 2 religious settlers on the court right now. And there, of course, has been an Arab judge, a Palestinian citizen of Israel. There is one now, there has been in the past. It's just not the way it was once. And I think that it's amazing to me that among the chief arguments of the Israeli right wing is that the court is this monolithic cabal of identical clone judges, all thinking along the same lines, all advancing these extreme left liberal universalist policies in every case, which is not correct in terms of the identity of the judges and their background, their politics, and their ideology. It is not correct in terms of Supreme Court rulings, which are, on the key left-right issues, are much more often supportive of the government positions than turning anything radically left. And on occasion, on rare occasion, well, it depends on how you count, of course, upholding, a liberal perspective on human rights and individual rights, and occasionally intervening in, or rejecting a Knesset law. And nothing angers the right wing as much as judicial review, which they claim is like a takeover, like a coup of the elected legislature or the executive. That's also the language we hear in some of the other populist regimes. And in the case of Israel, though, not that I think we're really that unique. I agree with you completely that we need to demystify Israel's uniqueness, but we do not have a constitution. So when it comes to the criticism of judicial review, the entire number of laws that have ever been struck down in Israel is 20 in Israel's history. And mostly they're not the whole law, usually just pieces of a law. And we don't have a constitution to give us any other anchor. So I think that, there's a lot of, I'm just going to be blunt, manipulation of this issue on the part of the right wing.
but that's also, I would say, why it's not surprising to me that they use this rhetoric, because it fits perfectly into, I mean, the very first idea, like the very first success of Begin when he got Likud kicked off. Like, it's really the same old story, and it fits perfect for the right wing to concentrate on this. And even though there has been changes over the last 20 years, like you're saying, I still think it's part of the same myth. It's part of the same story about the situation between the relationship between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews.
Yes.
So in that sense, it's not surprising that it's part of their rhetoric now.
No, I completely agree. Yeah. I just don't think it's totally accurate.
No,
I mean, the Ashkenazi Mizrahi identity thing, maybe.
I'm just analyzing it. I'm not saying that I think it's accurate. But another thing I just wanted to get back to is also the corona, because I think, I mean, getting back to where we were before about coalitions and the way those different cleavages plays into actual, like the budget situation and the corona strategy and whatever, I think it's really important to stress also that the fact that the main failure of the corona strategy in Israel has been within the ultra-Orthodox community. And to a certain extent, there has been really high, also very, very high in the Arab Palestinian, among Arab Palestinian Israelis. But I mean, if we look at the ultra-Orthodox, I think there again, we see this very concrete example of how the different cleavages and the fact that the Israeli governments always are complex coalition governments, how that also plays out in politics. So I think because we touch upon the fact that the corona strategy, that Netanyahu has used it for his own possibility to stay in power and delay the trials and all this. But one of the issues here then has been that he hasn't been pushing or demanding from the ultra-Orthodox community to do certain changes or to follow the law and the regulations to the same extent as others. Or they at least have taken their decision to not do it, and he hasn't been pushing back on it. And I think this is a very extreme maybe, but also an example of how those cleavages plays directly into Israeli politics and in this case, the corona strategy.
Yeah, no question. I mean, sorry, did you want to ask a question?
No, I just wanted to say, Dalia, that if you want to say something on this, because then I want to move to another issue. So go ahead.
I think that's correct for the most part. Well, I think just to quote, something that people are saying a lot in Israel now is like, this is the truth of Israeli society. The fact that somehow we keep it together day to day, and especially when there's a war or crisis. But when it comes down to it, those internal fragmentations, the fragmentation among the different sectors in Israeli society has always been very, very deep. And now that we're in a crisis that requires people, to display their manifestation of social solidarity, they can't do it.
Interesting. I want to move then to the cleavage. You've alluded to it to some degree, but the kind of the cleavage that goes both inside of Israel, but also outside, even though that difference is difficult to make with the de facto annexation, if you will. But what about the groups that are actually citizens in Israel, but are not Jews? That is, what about the Arabs and the Druze and others? The cleavages that they have, I would imagine to some degree, are the same that you find in the majority population. I mean, socio-economic issues, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also have this identity marker, which is played out differently historically for the Druze, for instance, compared to the Israeli Arab population. Who wants to say something about that?
I should start. Well, I mean, I think that there are some major differences. Listen, I mean, living as a minority is almost incomparable to living as a majority, especially in a state that is defined in its legislation as belonging to the majority. So they have very different set of attitudes. That manifests itself in various ways. The most obvious is that Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel are the strongest supporters of civil rights in Israel and minority rights. I mean, it makes perfect sense. They're the ones who need them. Them together with the left wing among the Jewish population, much stronger than everybody else. In terms of voting, though, they're in a very difficult and different situation. They, as we all know, have never really had any opportunity at executive power. They've never been invited into a government as an independent party, as an Arab representative independent party, and nor have they wanted to. I mean, it's a very complicated, push and pull. They don't want to go in because it requires them to make, a very strong symbolic statement about legitimizing an Israeli government that is in basically a permanent war with the Palestinians, who are in many cases, they're the same community. Of course, they have historical evolution in different directions, but we're talking about, in some cases, families across the Israeli citizen versus Palestinian divide. So that has been an ongoing source of tension. However, to make up for that, they have been very vocal in the legislature, but because they're not in the coalition, they tend not to have too much lawmaking power, although they sit on committees. And so, anyway, the point is there's been generally participation in elections, right? There's more participation than rejection, even at the lowest point. Well, the lowest point ever was a boycott of special elections that were held for prime minister in 2001 in the middle of the Intifada, after police fired on a demonstration and killed 13 citizens. And then turnout was at its lowest ever, 18%. But other than that, ever since the end of the martial law of the military regime in 1966, the Arab-Palestinian turnout rate in Israel has been, either close to the Jewish turnout or at the lowest level, about 49%. So, you're still talking about basically big levels of participation, and it has gone up in the last two cycles. And then the question of party representation is very complex, because when their votes were split among several parties that represented the diversity of the community, religious identity, secular identity, communism, which was not a bad word in the Israeli political context, they, especially when the threshold was raised, they just were in danger of not getting into Knesset. So, and for a long time, people had lost faith that there was a genuine need for 3 different parties or 4 different parties, and kind of said, as self-interest, it's all self-interest, they should unite. The parties united, turnout went up, they got more power than ever before. I'll skip all the different cycles. And that's I think been a bit of a giddy feeling for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, seeing the party eventually get 15 seats, its best showing ever, opening up the possibility of being the head of Knesset committees. They now chair 2 Knesset committees. The talk of them giving support to the government from the outside the coalition, or even joining a coalition, it didn't happen, but it was, opened up a really important debate that is energizing, I think, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. But the downside of having that one party is that it papers over all those differences. I mean, that's a good thing and it's a bad thing, because it kind of conflates them all, and it allows Jewish society to say, well, if you're Ayman Odeh and you represent, some of the more radical members, then we can dismiss your nice, moderate, cooperative position on stuff. And that creates a rift inside the Arab society as well in Israel, among Palestinian citizens. I use the terms interchangeably. And if anybody wants to talk about that, I'm happy to. But I just think it's a very complex and interesting evolution. We mentioned it briefly. Of course, it hasn't helped. Well, it hasn't helped that there's been a very nationalist, populist governing and campaign style over the last 10 years. It hasn't helped because it's created a deep lack of faith in the possibility of genuine political cooperation and the need for participation. I mean, it's very, very alienating. The passage of the nation state law was a watershed in that level of alienation. It's been a good thing in a way, I mean, in a bitter way, because the more Netanyahu attacks Palestinian citizens of Israel, the higher turnout becomes, because people get angry. And so, there is a mutual effect on that sense. Netanyahu gets his voters out, and Arab Palestinian citizens go out because they're angry about being attacked. So that dynamic is in play too. And at the same time, as I think Isabell reminds us, and rightfully so, there are major socioeconomic issues. Changes in the right direction, increasing participation in higher education, increasing participation in higher levels of the workforce, increasing participation in professional levels of the workforce. And there is serious poverty and high crime, high murder rates, and it's a real scourge. So it's a society that's going through transformation, but starting out at a much, a very disadvantaged level.
Again, I mean, it's important here to perhaps for the audience in particular that, I mean, when it comes to, if you compare the OECD countries and Israel, I mean, Israel is on the worst end of the Gini index in terms of the socioeconomic cleavages within society. So
it's also,
Isabell?
I think it's also in the just Turkey after when it comes to child poverty, for instance. So, and obviously this is very high and part of those groups that we're talking about now. And I one of the things I think, just to stress it a bit further, is really this internal cleavages and split also within the Arab, Palestinian, Israelis. I mean, the cleavage between the Sunnis and Bedouins, but also between Christian and Sunnis in northern Israel, and which is, it's very apparent if you really get into this. I mean, that they are very divided. Lots of times villages are divided, and they live quite separately in different villages, and the Druze have their own villages and so on. So I think it's a tremendous effort actually now that they managed to join all those four parties under the joint list, but it's also extremely hard, I think, to be able to keep this up. Also, as Dalia said, also when the voters know pretty much for sure that there is no way they will be invited to the government, you know. So, I mean, I think it's important to just also reflect on that despite that, people went and voted to such a high degree this last election. And I also think that's partly why Netanyahu now is advancing and trying to split this party up, because he also is very much aware of the cleavages. And in this case, I mean, we have this Islamic branch that it's more the Southern Islamic branch, that he knows that they are extremely dependent on some kind of economic plan for their what's called the Arab sector. And he is also talking about the reduce of crime, to have money and support put in to reduce the high crime rates within the community. So obviously he knows what to negotiate on to try to split this group up.
Yeah, absolutely true. It's just that it's not rocket science. I mean, the issue problem of violence and crime has been absolutely number one among the Arab community for years, and you know, it's very cynical in a way for Netanyahu to suddenly, you know, work on that, because their own parliamentarians have been working to try to, you know, make these changes for a long time. And in fairness, we have to also mention that the Netanyahu government did pass the biggest financial package ever to stimulate, you know, sort of social economic infrastructure development among the Arab community. It's I don't think there's anybody who kind of disagrees or denies that that's an important thing, but it was essentially a sort of devil's bargain. You know, it's Netanyahu's theory in general: provide material, you know, benefits, and attack anything that has to do with national identity, as if people will ever be satisfied with material advancement if it means sacrificing their identity.
But if I may then, this can brings us to questions that we've gotten, but also in general. So we have an Arab minority, Arab Palestinian minority in Israel. We have the Palestinian areas that are under different forms of administrative rule or control, including military, obviously. The two-state solution is perhaps not on the table. It hasn't been for a long time. It's been on life support, or even it's actually in coma for a long time, if you want to continue that analogy. But it is still something, as you mentioned, Dalia, that people poll on, as in people claim at least to be supportive of. But that, of course, begs the question, if we for a moment were to think, if not positively, then at least outside of the box, what would it be required? What would be required to actually move the political situation towards a solution? I'm saying solution specifically because it obviously does not necessarily have to be a two-state solution, right? Because the other one is the binational, which for a long time no one wanted to talk about except the so-called radicals, whatever they were radical in. And nowadays, because the two-state solution is very difficult to uphold, that fantasy, if you will, the binational issue perhaps has gotten a bit more leverage, but still not considered politically feasible or realistic. So what is the way forward? Dalia, please.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, you have to have a leader who has an interest on both sides in advancing some sort of a conflict resolution constitutional framework. On the Palestinian side, you have such a leader, but he's very, very weak politically, not to mention physically. We should also mention, of course, that Palestinians just lost one of their most prominent negotiators, Dr. Saeb Erekat, but he wasn't a political, leader at this point. But on the Israeli side, you have a prime minister who, frankly, does not want a final status resolution. I think that that's safe to say, even though I always reject the idea that I can divine Mr. Netanyahu's will, but his actions speak very clearly on this issue over the course of 11 years. And the idea of the Trump plan, I think it's quite obvious, was a red herring because even if it was a genuine plan that was simply very heavily favored, favored Israel very heavily, that you could say that might have been the case. But if that was really the case, then the administration would not have spent the first 3 years alienating and dismissing Palestinians with diplomatic insult after insult, and not just insult, but injury. Cutting out funding to the Palestinian UNRWA and Palestinian institutions, closing the U.S., the representation in the U.S., establishing the American embassy in Jerusalem. And these are things that basically say to the Palestinians, you are not wanted here. You don't just go away. And the Palestinians, sure enough, said, yeah, fine, we'll go away because we don't want to interact with you. So if you come out with a plan after all that, it almost doesn't matter how good the plan is. And this wasn't a good plan for Israel. And everybody knows it wasn't a good plan for Israel. And I don't mean the political elite. I mean Israelis and Palestinians. We have polled on this. My colleague Khalil Shikaki and I have done an extensive joint survey where we tested 15 different items within the Trump plan and the whole, attitudes towards the whole package. And it was just clear the Israelis were thrilled with almost everything in the plan, almost. And the Palestinians were, how to put this, not thrilled with pretty much any of it. So, I mean, the gaps there are enormous, even compared to the gaps in support for the old two-state solution. So at all levels, I think it's clear that we need a leader who actually is committed to some sort of final status resolution in agreement. I mean, it doesn't, if it's not by agreement, then it's a different animal altogether. It can just be Israel imposing its will. And I say Israel because Israel has the power to do that, the Palestinians do not. So that would be the first thing. And in order to, I don't think any of that, I don't think any negotiated final status resolution can happen tomorrow, even with the best leader of best intentions, because the political conditions are so abysmal for supporting any peace agreement. So I think to get there, there will have to be a process of stopping some of the major forces on the ground in terms of Israeli settlement growth and planning. There will need to be, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, bureaucratic and administrative facilitation of Palestinian economic livelihood, revival, right? Because there's huge interdependence based on the Paris Protocols, and the Paris Protocols allow for Israel to have an enormous amount of control over very, very technical and bureaucratic aspects that can be very hard to, track and describe, but it's almost like combined, they're all like a tap, that Israel can have more or less control over the Palestinian economy. And so it's very hard for Palestinians to have genuine economic growth in that situation. Of course, that contributes to government venality. I don't want to blame the occupation entirely for government corruption, but you cannot disconnect them either. Of course, I do not want to let any government official off the hook among Palestinian society, because the Palestinians are extremely dismayed at the level of corruption. And to that end, we have to think about Palestinian democracy. Now, I'm not saying that anything should wait until the Palestinians have a perfect democracy, because nobody in the world has a perfect democracy, except maybe Sweden, but certainly not the US or other, symbolic countries that seem to symbolize democracy. But I do think that any agreement that is signed will have much better chance of success if it's done with leaders who have the buy-in and the support, the legitimate support of their people. You can't have that until you have at the very least a legitimate election, and you can't have a legitimate election in the current situation. The Palestinian political institutions are not open and free enough for there to be a free and fair election tomorrow. So I think that all of those processes have to change, and I think that those are the kinds of things that I don't think that there's any excuse for not starting soon. Even a right-wing government in Israel, which is the most likely scenario, should have an interest in certainly on the economic piece of it. Even Netanyahu should contribute to that. Certainly on the democracy piece of it, would be good for everybody. I know Netanyahu, a right-wing government, wouldn't necessarily want to, stop settlements, but they could slow them. There's plenty to do that would help facilitate, or not just facilitate, but support the conditions for both reaching and implementing a future solution. And in my opinion, of course, revising the entire approach to what kind of solution we're getting towards. I mean, if we go back to negotiating for the two-state plan that was developed 20 years ago, in my analysis, we're not very likely to get there because that plan is no longer realistic. Instead, I would, I have been working in great detail on looking at a solution based on the idea of two states in a confederated association, which I think is the only realistic approach. It sort of takes the national identity elements of the two-state solution and recognizes them, while acknowledging the interdependence of these populations, the fact that they share a small geographic region that can't truly be divided if you're to have any economic viability, certainly not in terms of environment, health, resources. There's nothing like Corona to make this clear. So, I mean, I think that laying the groundwork for a more realistic solution once we get to the stage of negotiations, I think goes a long way. And also a two-state confederation helps diffuse some of the most sensitive and explosive symbolic final status issues. Those would be my recommendations.
Thank you. Isabell?
I must say I don't have much to add. I think that was a really good way to wrap it up. So maybe instead some questions, maybe, since.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you've answered some of the questions that have been asked. So we don't necessarily have any specific ones that are left, in my opinion. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, in that case, I think that going back to where I started, I think it's obviously going to be extremely interesting to see what's happened when if there will be a Biden government. Because I mean, obviously it's important, the Israeli and Palestinian leadership is important, and they are lacking now on both sides, but for a very long time, but it would also be interesting then to see what will happen when Biden starts to work on and if he will have a different path than Barack Obama, which people put lots of hopes into, and he wasn't really delivering the way lots of people thought he was going to deliver with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think that's something that I will keep an eye on, and obviously also I think that what the Israelis have been extremely successful in doing over the last decade now is to basically, as we have touched upon here, domestically, but also internationally, to make this question less relevant, to make the two-state solution an issue that is not discussed to the same extent as it was in the past. And then obviously also, I mean, the Palestinian leadership has their share in this, and the division between Gaza and the West Bank and all that. But I think this and I think this normalization is really interesting that has been taking place the last month here, because I think that's another way of shifting the focus away from the occupation, what's going on the territories, the Palestinian, the two-state solution, or whatever solution we're talking about, and shifting it away from that, and is still saying something that, look, the Middle East is opening up, old conflicts are starting to be solved. We are having, I mean, just to take an example, I talked with a friend today in Israel. He told me that right now he's getting all those kind of efforts in, ads in his email box now in Hebrew from Bahrain and from the United Arab Emirates about if he wants to invest in those countries, and it's in Hebrew, and it's like, so I mean, I think it's important that there is a shift taking place, and it's not to the good for the Palestinians, this shift that has been taking place. And I think in that, again, in that perspective, I think the Netanyahu governments have been extremely successful in making that shift and shifting the focus away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict towards other issues in the region.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, both Trump and Netanyahu have created new facts on the ground, if you want to use that old term, which I doubt very much that a Biden administration will have the political clout or energy to try and undo. So, I mean, in that sense, again, we have a new reality, so to speak, that everyone has to somehow manage. Not a very necessarily optimistic note to end things on. Dalia, we have literally 60 seconds. If you have any glimmer of hope to offer us before we wrap things up.
Yeah, start reading all my articles about a two-state confederation. It's the only
Very
hope
good.
that I found. I don't think it's a magic bullet. I want to be clear. I don't think we should be looking at this like missionaries. I just think it's a more realistic approach. Not everybody has thought about it. I think revising how we look at final status is essential. It's a condition, non-negotiable.
Yep.
If negotiations are ever to succeed.
That makes sense and is reasonable. Thank you very much for a very illuminating conversation. I hope we'll find time to continue it at some point, because obviously there is still stuff to talk about. Thank you very much to Dalia and to Isabell.
Thank you.
Thank you to you for inviting us. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.